In the museum, attention shifted from painting to painting, the eye forced around, so it was impossible to focus on any single work. The nightmare was of a giant bluebottle fly which buzzed, "I'm all there is." Where cars don't go are shortcuts. My grandfather was forced to recognize his age when another younger man offered his seat on the bus. When one travels, one might hit a storm. The shoe must be tied to the ankle. As for we who love to be astonished, McDonald's is the world's largest purchaser of beef eyeballs. They went out with bows and armbands to shoot at the hay. It's as easy as waves slopping water. Traverse, watch, and cease. Ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And the passage that you heard at the beginning of this episode came from Lyn Hejinian's book-length poem, My Life. But what we're going to be doing in this episode is not just talking about that book, but rather gathering a bunch of thoughts that we've had about the last 3 books that we read, and some other contributions that I brought to the table that tie in with these notions of essays and essaying and stories and storying. Because as you may or may not have guessed, listener, those of you who've been listening for a long time and have a sense of who we are, the last 3 episodes were chosen by Suzanne, and I was very excited to read them and think through them. And I thought, what can I contribute to this? And of course, the answer was weird experimental poetry that nobody's read. Although many people have read My Life. It's actually sort of a landmark book that has been taught a lot, and I've met all sorts of people who don't really engage in poetry who have a deep fondness for this book.
And it's so neat to think about the ways in which poetry enters into the conversation. Like we've been talking about the form of the essay, the form of story and essaying and storying. And poetics has kind of crept in at the edges every now and then. So it'd be nice to put it in the middle of things.
Yeah. I also thought it would be nice to start with My Life because the author, Lyn Hejinian, sadly passed away earlier this year in February. And she's been on my mind, and it seemed like a wonderful excuse to reread a book that has meant a lot to me as a reader and as a writer.
When did you first encounter it?
I'm sure I first encountered it when I was starting to get into poetry and specifically experimental poetry in my early 20s. It was a book that even then people talked about a lot as being a classic of a school of poetry called language poetry, which for those of you on the outside sounds like a weird thing to call a school of poetry. And for those of you who know anything about it, it also is still a weird thing to call a school of poetry. But it was a group of loosely affiliated poets and publishers who were interested in thinking about, well, a whole set of issues around how politics and language intersect, but they were particularly interested in questions of open texts, of texts that don't try to tie themselves down to one particular way of meaning, but open themselves up to broad interpretive possibilities, partially in their mind as an attempt to avoid a kind of consumerist capitalist notion of a product that you're going to take this, I don't know, poem, this novel, this whatever, and extract the meaning from it and use it. And instead, it's a space where you have, ideally, a kind of liberatory experience with the text that, as you probably could tell from the opening quotation, isn't easily pinned down, but might nevertheless be highly suggestive and evocative and beautiful.
I'm really struck by what you're saying about the ways in which this mode of writing poetry opens up to sort of broad interpretive possibilities, like this generosity. Because one of the things I noticed when I was taking a look at Lyn Hejinian's work, because I knew you were going to want to talk about it, it felt similar to, not the same as, but similar to, it felt echoes of when I'd read Gertrude Stein. We'd read that together. And when you mentioned this sort of openness, maybe that's one of the things that's quite different here. In other words, while there's a texture similarity in the poetry, or in the use of language and the ways in which it refers, it feels so much more controlled and tight when I read Gertrude Stein. I really enjoy it, but it's tight and controlled. I feel like she's driving the bus. And this is a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Gertrude Stein's method is often to work a piece a lot and to do it in an immediate way. So she'll get a phrase in her mouth and she'll think about that phrase and keep typing out that phrase in different variations and really work it over in a very pleasing way. Now, I know you didn't have enough time to read the entirety of the book, but that actually does happen in the book where some of these phrases, for those of us who love to be astonished, keep showing up again and again in new situations. And, this is partially inspired by Stein. She certainly read her Stein, but it ends up feeling like a very differently controlled bus, right? You're going through these sentences and how they're connected to each other. And to me, at least, it feels like there's a lot of control behind them, but it's not driving you somewhere. You're just going where it's going.
And there's a big difference, too, in the way in which my life, it's got this kind of, you mentioned this kind of accretive quality where it grows over time. And that, again, is really doing something quite different.
Yeah, she published it multiple times. First came out in 1980, and it was a collection of 37 paragraph-long pieces, each of which had 37 sentences. She was 37 years old when it was published. And then a few years later, she's got the version that most of us would read today, which is certainly the version that I first encountered, where it is 45 sections of 45 sentences each, published when she was 45. She then would later go on to write, by request, My Life in the 90s, continuing this process. So there is a kind of accretive thing. Like my understanding is that she went back in and sort of stretched these passages out and added to them in a way that feels conceptually like, as she is growing, this curious representation of her life is also growing.
And that's very harmonious with some of the things we were saying about Montaigne's essays, like the collection grows with him over time. Thinking about the form of the essay and the form of the story and so on that we've been talking about for a while now, where do you feel like this kind of poetic production fits? For those who don't know a whole lot about language poetry, it looks like prose on the page. But could you talk about that? Yeah.
Not all language poetry does, certainly, but this does. And actually quite a lot of it did, because they had a bit of a mindset towards that. Let me say that when I was reading some of these essays and the Montaigne and the collection, and where they're thinking specifically about the shape of native nonfiction, the shape of these essays, that there is a sense of going into a form, this essay form, and not knowing what it's going to be as a reader. Maybe the writer knows, but as the reader, not knowing where you're going to end up, not knowing what the form will be. The forms in that anthology that we talked about are all over the map. There's one that's entirely in capital letters in one big paragraph with like poetic lines crossing between it. There's the ones that are in small little sections with different demarcations between them. There's ones that read like just argumentative essays that you might find in an academic journal or in, a magazine. Like there's all sorts of different things you don't know. And it's that sense of opening yourself up to and encountering the unexpected that you can get from essays and from at least certain types of poetry. And so that was an interesting connection I found. And I think that there is a certain trend towards a kind of essayistic approach to some poets, especially in the last however many years, for a number of reasons. One of which is that sense of we're inventing a new form that will fit whatever this project is that I'm working on. One of which is also that there's been an increased interest in incorporating documentary material into poems. I don't know if you know, this is a much older example than the timeline I'm thinking of, but William Carlos Williams Patterson, which is a long poem about Patterson that includes quite a lot of historic documents.
Yeah, I got that actually not too long ago. I'm actually really excited about reading it.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll talk about it someday.
Maybe we will. So I don't know. That was those were on my mind. That sense of adventure.
That totally makes sense.
There was also a book that I picked up not too long ago by an author named Brian Dillon called Essayism. It's not a history of the essay. Instead, it is a series of, as we might say, lyric essays that take some prompt from thinking about some essays that he's read and running with it. And one of the things that he says early on in the book in a essay called On Essayism is he kind of defines some things about essayism as an attitude towards the form. And he highlights its spirit of adventure and its unfinished nature,
Mm.
which I think we've seen a lot of in some of the other discussions of how essays work. Although I also think it's something that we've seen in the discussion of how stories work, that there's a sense of the story as we encounter it in Simpson's book, where it exists, but it doesn't really exist until the telling. And then it doesn't finish existing, even like because you carry it with you in different ways. Like it doesn't stop existing.
Yeah, that closed quality that you were evoking in that quotation from Dylan, it's certainly a lot different what's happening in story, and I'll come back to that one second. But even with regard to some of the essays, like one of the things I'm remembering right now is how the abrupt sort of precipitous ending of some of the essays that we're looking at in Shapes of Native Nonfiction. But then others, I'm thinking, for example, of Tuolumne, where it's one of the essays in the section that's described as coiling, like the basket that's very tightly coiled. And there you have this very strong sense of the circle coming back round tightly again in a kind of almost sealed way. And then, as you were saying, in story, too, with that kind of variability, on the one hand, it's closed when we get to the end of the story, but especially this regenerative notion of story, understood in terms of indigenous cultures that Leanne Simpson articulates. As you say, the story is part of a sort of cycle of regeneration and growth and regrowth. That language of the story as seed really underlines that. So there is a beginning, middle, and end. There is a cycle to the story, but there's not really a terminus as long as the people keep going and keep telling that story. But like that circling around is almost a kind of ending, right? Even though it's an ending which is also a beginning.
Yeah. And also, I think of things like the bodies of water that kept coming up in the essays we were reading, the rivers. The Tuolumne River is a river that, although it may be in rough shape, and although it may have a sort of source and an end point, the river itself is the river of flowing. It's sort of the verbing part of the river, right? And that itself is the process rather than the destination.
I think that's exactly right. That emphasis on process is totally what comes out of, whether we're talking about story, whether we're talking about essay, whether we're talking about poetic forms, it's that process. I think that's absolutely at the forefront.
Is this the sort of thing that excited you about essays when you were first encountering them, so to speak, in the wild as a reader?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like the form of the essay is something that I've kind of grown up with over time, like not exactly like one time, but it's something that I stumbled on as a form of writing when I was sort of my middle teens. And I know this sounds a little bit ridiculous, but the way I learned how to type was through typing out a copy of Virginia Woolf's essays. Like I learned where you put your fingers, and then you'd have to type something. So I just gotten this book, so I was typing this out. So I got to, how there's a particular way you get to know things that you either copy out by hand or you type, like they're in your head in a different way. So I had that kind of very personal relationship with the text because of that. And I think, it's not that her essays are that wonderful or fabulous, but I was really attracted to the ways in which the essay was like a tool or a space or a kind of a playground where you could do stuff. Like some of her essays, like in The Common Reader and so on, are really trying to do things that are sort of ambitious in different directions. But I really loved also reading her book reviews. Like there were a lot of her book reviews from, I think it was the Times Literary Supplement that would be reprinted in some of the anthologies I had. And those were like relatively short. She was clearly just writing a book review, but they always did something unexpected. Like they'd do the review thing, but they'd often have like a really interesting and often slightly weird choice of quotation near the head of the book review. And then they would go somewhere completely unexpected by the time you got to the end, and they would just end. Yeah. And I remember thinking, what is going on here? And the surprising quality of it, and the sense of like almost you'd come into a conversation, like you'd come into the room and the conversation was happening, and then you left the room and the conversation was kind of still happening somewhere. That's what the essay kind of meant to me in those years. And so over time, I've obviously read a lot more different kinds of essays and different writers of essays, but like that sense of entering a room and you're kind of there and then you leave, but it's all still happening somewhere in that space of essaying, that has stuck with me.
And that, I think, is some of the stuff that attracted me to poetry, right? That poetry it wasn't the flowery language. It wasn't the love of literally flowers and nature and like that it wasn't that kind of lyricism. It was the space where text could play and where form could be brought in, but it was very much up to the author. It was very much like not a pre-established thing what form was going to happen here.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are like long traditions of poems that have forms that are handed down, et cetera, et cetera. But especially in the poetry that I got very excited about, it was no holds barred. It was anything could happen here. It was, and that was exciting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the variety of thought and connection that was happening was tremendously exciting
Mm-hmm.
and liberating.
Mm-hmm.
And the essays that I was reading when I was around this time that I was reading for my own didn't necessarily capture that the same way, though some of them were quite good. I became very fond of George Orwell's essays.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, what I was really appreciating was just this very precise quality of his language. The way he would structure a sentence was just chiseled and exquisite. So it was that sense of craft that one might appreciate. But I didn't remember his essays taking these tremendous leaps of form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, I'd always heard that Montaigne was kind of all about that, and that was where the seed of this essaying began.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually was able to find a few sources of people who were doing more essaying like that. And like every time I read those kinds of essays, the ones that get me the most excited, including some of the ones in that Shapes of Native Nonfiction book that we read, I can read them as poems, not in the same way that you read them as essays, but like I can see that they are built within thinking about how form and connection to the reader, of thoughts in the writer's head is made just like a poem.
Are there any examples that come to mind from that collection?
I think the one that we talked a bit at the end of that episode by Alyssa Washuda is a lot like that. It's told in these little fragmented sections. And the way that those fragmented sections both connect and differ from each other had that formal tension and opened up that space of possibility that I quite like in a poem.
Yeah. And again, one of the things that was striking in that I thought was, again, the way there were repeated like refrains or phrases. And that is maybe a little bit in keeping with what you were saying about Lyn Hejinian's work, that the phrase that would recur is kind of not exactly an aspect of form in the work, but it's more like, I don't know, like a refrain or something that comes back, a thing that keeps coming back.
At least in the Hejinian book for me, when I was reading it, some of those phrases are like that, the next door neighbor on a sitcom, and they walk into the room and you're like excited to see them and you put it on, it's like, oh, and as for we who love to be astonished is back. Yay.
Yeah.
And it's weird to develop that kind of relationship with a phrase, especially a phrase as, I don't know, non-showy as for we who love to be astonished. But I did. And the fact that text made me do that was amazing.
And does the phrase feel a little different when it shows up different times? Like I'm thinking about the way like a punchline joke, in a skit or something like that functions, where you hear it one time and it's kind of whatever, and then you hear it again and it has another effect. And, is it like not that it's funny, but like, does it have a different effect over time as you encounter it?
Well, it does a bit because it isn't the punchline, it's the setup, because it's whatever's going to follow it. And what follows it are all sorts of different types of things. The one that was in that opening passage is one of the most striking and outre ones, but there's all sorts of things that come after it. And in a book where the text is not holding you by the hand, where it is presenting you with a series of sentences that are not cohering, but not cohering. You're floating upon them in a sense. These waves of sentences that are going by you. A familiar friend goes by, so it helps ground you in the process of reading in a way that I always appreciated.
That's really neat.
But what are some of the phrases in the Washuda essay that you were thinking of?
Well, it functions a little bit differently. That is, it's not so much that there's a particular phrase that appears throughout the entire essay, but in different sections, there's this refrain-like quality. Not exactly like the refrains you would find in a poem, but serving something like the same function. So, for example, in the opening paragraph, which we talked about previously, where she's talking about her great-great-great-grandfather, Tumult, the headman of the Cascades, and his death. And she says, I am always writing that Tumult was hanged. I am always writing that his daughters were taken to Fort Vancouver. I am always writing about the resistance of the women. Actually, I'm not tired of writing about this. So there's that kind of repetition. But there are other examples of this as well elsewhere. Like, for example, In one of the sections, she's talking about treaties, and she says, the U.S. has been a party to many treaties. Some bind the U.S. to its allies. And it goes on a bit. Some are with other international sovereigns. It goes on a little bit. Some are with tribes. All of these have been broken. And she goes, so that some are kind of refrain gives you that kind of, like I said, it's like not exactly like poetry, but it's a repetitive form that is clearly doing something. And there's another one that becomes like much more, like even more emphatic, where it goes like this. I used to like to keep safety pins attached to my messenger bag because I used them to clean pepper out of my teeth when I was out of the house. I used to drink water straight from the tap. I used to have no idea what my blood quantum was because nobody had ever thought to tell me something like that. I began to carry floss. I began to drink from cups. I began to tell people my blood quantum when they asked, even when I didn't want to. So it's like I began, like this kind of thing. And it's doing something in terms of the progress of the text. Like it's like these moments of stumbling or reiteration, like that do something to the rhythm of the essay as a whole. And I found that it's a really powerful essay in general.
Yeah, no, I thought it was very careful in the way that it deployed those kinds of tactics of how it would emphasize things. I'm tired of hearing myself saying this and repeating this again and again, like emphasizes how often you say this. Like it puts it into a form very efficiently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And to be able to quickly like pull the rug out of that and say, actually, I'm not tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderfully effective way to do that.
Yeah, I know, especially because that sort of pulling up the rug that you're describing, that sort of pulling away the veil is something that happens really emphatically at the end of the essay when she's talking about a post-apocalyptic world and apocalypse, which is literally sort of taking away the veil. So the thing she's talking about is also what she's enacting over the course of the whole essay, right? Yeah. So that's, again, one of the reasons it's so powerful. One of the other essays in this collection, Shapes of Native Nonfiction, that seemed a little bit resonant in terms of form was the piece by Kim Tallbear, where there was a very carefully set form. It's called Critical Poly 100s, which is the last essay in the third section, which is on plating. And so it's all coming from a single source, but segmented. And segmented, we've seen other essays that are segmented in that section as well, but this one's segmented in a very precise way. Like in the opening, she says, I began writing the Critical Poly 100s as part of an online writing group, but I now write them on my own. Some writers are not rigid about the 100-word limit. I personally love the discipline of it and work hard to make each piece exactly 100 words. And then we get these 100s in reverse chronological order. Did that strike you? Like when you saw that, were you like, this is the kind of thing I've seen, or is this resonant?
Oh, of course. Not so much from language poetry necessarily, but from related traditions of constraint writing, of other types of constraint writing. There's a book that I quite enjoy by a poet who means quite a lot to me named Jackson McClough, who was very interested overall in chance operations and applying rules to text to make other texts out of them. He was a friend of John Cage's. I had the lovely pleasure of meeting him when I was a young person, and it was great. And he put out a book called Pieces 06, which is, he bought himself a notebook. It was 200 pages long. He decided to write pieces that would be 6 pages in that notebook. And over time, he developed a few rules around them, but the fundamental one, as he says, is that whatever they are, whatever they look like, they are poems, sort of by fiat more than anything else, because the types of texts in this book are all over the map. There are some that are just kind of lists of words in that mode of writing poetry. There are some that are stories, narratives. One of them gets a little pornographic. It's kind of weird. And some of them are things that seem like essays that might not be out of place in a collection of essays where people are thinking a lot about forms. There's one all about giving a cat some tranquilizers, which is like lovely, touching concern, but also trying to be playful in a way that half feels like, oh, we're in a terrible situation, so I have to make a joke now. But, it teases it out. And you sort of go from one end of that moment to another, where you start, worried about the holding the cat, and you end thinking about all the fancy food you're going to have to buy for it now.
Yeah, I'm really struck by what you were saying about how he kind of makes these into poems, or asserts that they're poems, like kind of by fiat. What is it that makes them poems?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's like Sure. They are poems because he is a poet and he gets to decide that sort of thing,
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah.
They're also poems because they are governed by form, and he's going into it with a sense of openness that you might bring to poetry. Like his position towards what he's writing is that of someone who writes a poem rather than someone who writes an academic paper or some
kind of expository.
Yeah, or even if he's writing a piece of fiction, like he's still writing it from the point of view or from the positionality of being a poet. And I think that's something that we see in a lot of the essays from the anthology.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the lyric essay, which is a phrase that occurs in the introduction of Shapes of Native Nonfiction and then comes up again in a couple of the different essays, giving examples of this idea of the lyric essay, both from Indigenous writers and non-Indigenous writers. And so is that a mode, like I just don't know enough about it, is that a mode that's emerged as in some ways growing out of things like what you saw in Jackson McLough? Like in other words, is there a move in language poetry or elsewhere in poetry that then generates this or contributes to the emergence of this concept of the lyric essay?
I'm not in a position to unpack its history. I've heard of, but have not read the book that everybody is referring to where this idea of the lyric essay is getting hashed out. That said, obviously there are people who've been writing essays that are thinking about it as a poet would, or even as a lyric poet would. And I don't know if the source that they're talking about, if the theorists that they're talking about are thinking of those two things as separate or the same. For me, that is the interesting thing of what's going on, is approaching an essay not like a student or not like a typical, let's say, academic where you're trying to write a paper to prove a point and you're calling it an essay, but it's maybe something else. Instead, you are approaching it as a poet, as somebody who is thinking about form and thinking about sound and thinking about ways that meaning or meaningness get transferred other than how they get packaged up into sentences and explained.
So we're like, I guess, to make sure I'm getting what you're saying, like rather than being concerned with the meaning of those sentences and the ways in which they're hanging together to create a coherent narrative or whatever it is, right, or an argument or whatever, something else is happening with language, something different is happening with language.
And possibly something as well as that, but there is something else motivating some of the primary forms of how meaning is happening or how the experience of reading the essay works on the reader. It's not just that they are getting that packet of information that's being passed to you through the sentences.
Something is happening.
But something is happening through how it's written.
And that, as we're talking, I'm reflecting on the ways in which these, generic categories we have, like this is poetry, this is an essay, this is story, whatever, like, or lyric essay, any of these things. These categories kind of work and kind of don't work. Like the contents of the categories is slippery enough that they keep slipping out of the categories, which is kind of neat. And that makes me wonder if one of the things we're finding is that we talked also about like just now about the lyric essay today over the last couple of days, but also in the past about word art, a phrase that Lee Maracle used to use to talk about both what's produced orally as part of orature or oratory, but also what might be on the page in written form. So I'm wondering if how good are our terms? Like, are these terms serving us? Obviously, we use the terms that we have, right? But what is going on when these terms have become really slippery and things are not staying in their categories too well?
Okay.
I know you love that.
Yeah, well, this is where I'm going with this, is that from my perspective, what happens is that you've picked the right thing to read.
Oh, yes, well.
When you're reading something and it's like, oh, that category is not so good for me anymore, then you've gotten some of the good stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that totally makes sense.
Categories, I don't know. I guess, here I'm just talking, but categories for me are things that you apply when they're useful for as long as they're useful. So if something makes sense to describe as an essay or as a poem, it's because you're highlighting something about the text that makes it resonant with other things that you've called essays or poems. And yet you don't want to have it be a closed meaning. You don't want to, force it into those categories unless you're trying to sell it, unless it's a product that you need to market in that way. And then, it's a science fiction novel about this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, yeah, okay, fine. Like maybe that's still something good and you want it. Like I'm not saying that's inherently a bad thing, but And I don't want to end up being too, I don't know, indie hipster precious about things, but there can be something special about having a space for a type of communication or language or story or however you want to think about it that isn't so easily pinned down. That when you want to talk about it, you want to talk about it in ways that don't necessarily include a definition that's going to bound it. Story is never defined or bounded in Leanne Simpson's book.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, yes and no. Like, so coming back to the essay and the, multiple forms of the essay, one of the things I'm thinking about is the ways in which shapes of native nonfiction, when Washuta and Warburton put these pieces together, they don't just put them in sort of haphazardly, and they also don't, follow this one rigid order. There are 4 different sections, and there's a meaning behind having there be 4 different sections, and each one is enacting a different aspect of the exquisite vessel of the basket, right? And they're each reflecting, and this comes out in the introduction, the different positionality, not just the people who are contributing, but each of those people's own situatedness within their communities. So there's this heterogeneity, and yet it's within a system of some kind, right? And similarly, when Leanne Simpson is talking about story, absolutely there's this incredible variety of story that exists, but there are also these 2 extremely broad categories of story, right? The kind that is reserved for ceremonial use, that belongs to the community, that is very ancient, tends to be told only under certain circumstances, often at certain times of year and under certain conditions. And then there's one's own stories. And yet it is not the case that these stories are over here and these stories are over here, but rather there's this intimate connectivity between the stories. So, for example, we talked about the creation story, right, which is one shared communal collective story that's kind of grounds the community as a whole. And yet the story of my own birth is also the creation story, right? Or when Simpson's telling it, she talks about her first daughter's birth as, again, that same creation story. And that same notion emerges and occasionally in the essays in Shapes of Native Nonfiction. For example, in Tuolumne, Deborah Miranda's essay, when she's talking about her father's experience, she says it was his personal creation story, which is not the same as, but really resonant with Leanne and Simpson says, which is a really long way of saying, like, I really like categories and I kind of want to keep them. And I feel when I see things like that in Leanne Simpson's Dancing on Our Turtle's Back or Washuta and Warburton in Shapes of Native Nonfiction, I see categories functioning in this, I don't know if that liberatory is the right word, functioning in a way that is generous and makes space for the individual while situating the individual in this web. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so striking.
Yeah, I think they give you a useful heuristic. That's a big word. Well, I can't think of an easier word.
It's only 3 syllables.
It's
okay.
fine. We'll heuristic. It's a way of doing a thing, I guess, is a way of putting it. They're a useful tool for how you might think about the essays that you're about to read, the stories that you encounter, and with that distinction between the stories that are for this purpose and the stories that are personal. Part of the reason for making those categories is that you understand that some readers certainly need to understand why those stories are not for you or not in this book or not to be taken lightly. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Maybe none of the stories should be taken lightly, but nevertheless, like those categories are there so that you can think about them in useful ways, but they're not there to define what is or isn't a story. Mm-hmm. That's true. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. Though one of the things that happens too, and we talked about this actually now and then, we talked about this, over the last little while, story and history, which, in the sort of Western culture we live in tends to be understood as 2 totally different things. Those are braided together in a really interesting kind of way. So that history is story and story is history. I mean, every history is story, but I guess not maybe every story is history.
Maybe.
Right? But I find that also like really interesting to think with. Like, in other words, what happens when that boundary is not that it's porous exactly, but it's not what we thought it was.
Well, and I will also say in terms of those categories, which the Shapes of Native Nonfiction organize, like those are wonderful categories for thinking both about how you might read the essays you're about to read and how you might think about essays as made things, so to speak. If you understand what goes into making them and what you might appreciate in them, that'll help you get more out of an essay in the wild. But I don't know, but I strongly suspect that there were essays in that collection which moved from one section to the other as they were assembling it, because it's not as if these are stable or rigid categories. Some of them obviously clearly went into this category, I'm sure, but some of them clearly could belong to more than one. And that's fine. Like categories, again, like
it's a means to knowledge.
Yeah, and I generally like them when they can be open. Well, that brings to a conclusion this first cluster of episodes with our new scheme of recording them and thinking about them. I hope, listener, that you've had fun with us. We've certainly had fun from our secret location on the Upper West Side of New York.
Yeah, and it's been really tiring in a good way, but also really interesting and different to record 4 episodes over 2 days.
Yeah.
Right. And to be in conversation in the sustained kind of way and to have everything, kind of intermingled, like distinct yet intermingled. Like it's one conversation in 4 parts as opposed to 4 different conversations. At least that's how it feels to me.
It's been really interesting having those books come one after another and talking about more than one of them in the space of a day. And really having those conversations fresh on our minds and informing later conversations as we have them. Like we always attempted to do that in our clusters before. I hope this time we were able to make more of them, and I hope that was an enjoyable experience for the listeners.
I hope so too. And it's been neat how we've been able to punctuate what we've been doing. That is, have a kind of a rhythm to the days. And in the middle of the day, between the first episode we recorded and the second one, going to a museum space and looking at things together, which just sort of pushes you in a different kind of direction. And I feel like that's been really interesting for us. Like you said, I hope it's interesting for the listeners too.
Yeah. And, due to the nature of this secret location that we're in, there may have been some interesting background noises throughout the episode, and I hope that was all right.
That's what they call local color.
Exactly. You can't record in a secret location in New York without getting some traffic noises and some helicopter sounds and some people walking by the hallway and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So wonderful. We will, listeners, talk to you the next time we talk to you. But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, and we would always love to hear from you. Show notes with links to things that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/75. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts at Megaphonic. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.